This is chapter 1, and it deals with an introduction to the human body. We set the foundation for everything else that we're going to be looking at. Anatomy deals with the structures in the body, and physiology deals with how does it work. And so you put the two together. Obviously, they work hand in hand. There's interrelationships between them. We often say in A&P that structure determines the function. So when you look at whether it's a bone, a muscle, etc., you look at the structure of it, and that gives you clues as to how it is supposed to function under normal conditions. I always tell students, keep that in mind when you're asked to explain how something works, the physiology of it. Excuse me. Keep in mind what the structure is. That will give you clues. Now, there's different types of anatomy. First off, there's gross anatomy versus microscopic anatomy. Gross anatomy, you're looking at things that you can see unassisted. You see it with the naked eye. So you're talking about, you can see your arm, you can see a bone, you can see the eye, the ear, etc. So gross anatomy is looking at large things. Now, the microscopic anatomy is when you're looking at structures that can only be seen with some type of a magnification device. Usually you're talking about a microscope. Theoretically, you could be talking about a magnification lens of any type. But the point is you cannot see it because it is so small without assistance. And so certainly if you're talking about the cellular level, you wanting to see a muscle cell, you want to see an individual bone cell, that would fall under microscopic anatomy. And then we have further divisions too. We have both regional and systemic anatomy. Regional anatomy is where you're going to be looking in a particular area or region of the body, and what are the interrelationships? Maybe you're talking about in the pelvic cavity. What are the interrelationships between the structures found there? Systemic anatomy then is where you're not looking at a region, but you're looking at a particular organ system and the structures that make that up. So maybe you're talking about the cardiovascular system. So cardiovascular systemic anatomy, you'd be looking at what is the structure of the heart, what is the structure of all of the various blood vessels. And so one person realistically cannot know everything about everything in great detail. And so you'll find that people tend to specialize in one area versus another. Homeostasis, this is directly related to physiology in terms of what is homeostasis. First off, it's kind of this internal balance, this internal equilibrium. And the body's constantly trying to maintain this internal balance. So if you start to get off balance a little bit, the body's going to make adjustments to bring it back within the normal range. And the whole purpose of this is to have everything in the body working together in the most efficient manner. Certainly when we look at any living organism, as large organisms, including humans, there's certain levels of organization when we look at the anatomy or the structural components of it. Like I say, you'll see this for a lot of different organisms, certainly with humans. There is the chemical level, that is the smallest level. And then the next level will be the cell. Now the cell's made up of thousands and thousands of chemicals that come together and form compounds, and then the compounds come together and they form these certain structures as we see in the cell, and we will have a chapter where we will look specifically at all those components. A cell is the basic, most fundamental unit of life. You cannot get smaller than a cell and consider it living. The cell is the smallest living entity of life. You have a group of similar cells that will work together to carry out a particular function, and that's a tissue, such as a bone tissue. You have more than two tissue types come together and they'll form an organ, such as, say, the heart. You have several organs come together and work together to carry out a particular function, and you have an organ system, such as the cardiovascular system or the skeletal system. And then you bring all those organ systems together. In the human body, there are 11 organ systems, and that will form the entire organism. You'll notice in A&P we do, just kind of by tradition, set up the way of studying, the way your book is written, and the way we introduce things is by systems. So we will study each system separately, but you have to understand that all of the systems have to work together and are dependent upon each other for proper and most efficient functioning for the well-being of the organism. And these different levels of organization are interrelated. In other words, if you have some type of an issue at the chemical level, you're going to see that into the cell. Now, it may not be immediately, but if the cells are functioning abnormally, you're going to eventually see that change in the tissue. If the tissue is functioning abnormally, then it proceeds up to the organ, and eventually you're going to see it as a potential, say, disorder or disease symptom. So you can't have a change at one level and expect it to be isolated there. All of these levels are interrelated. And this is just a diagram just kind of showing you how you start up here at the chemical level and you keep building and building until finally you get the organism. So what are the different organ systems? These are the 11 organ systems that you find in most animals, including the human body. There is the integumentary system. That is your skin. It's a major system for protection. It keeps the outside environment out and the internal environment separate. Anything that enters into your body, it's going to be very closely regulated. One of the major areas things that pass through or is prevented from passing through, such as, say, bacteria, is the skin, the integumentary. Now, with the integumentary system, besides the skin, you'll notice a lot of organ systems as we studied have what we call accessory structures. So these are additional things. So for the integumentary system, we also include hair, nails, things like glands, your sweat glands, your oil glands. The skeletal system is comprised, obviously, of your bones. It helps to provide protection, support. It's attachment points for muscles. It's involved with a lot of mineral production. The muscular system is for movement. It also is involved with helping to maintain your internal body temperature, because when muscles contract, that generates heat. Your nervous system and your endocrine system are both communication systems. Your nervous system, which is your brain, your spinal cord, and all your peripheral nerves, it's a communication system that when it receives a stimulus, the response is going to typically be immediate, very quick, very, very fast response, but it's going to be very short-lived. It's like you respond, you're done, that's it. The endocrine system, as I just said, is also a communication system. It takes a little bit longer for it to, think of it as get up and running. It receives the stimulus, but there's a delay before you get the response typically. But the response is going to be much longer lasting. And what we're talking about with the endocrine system are your glands that produce and secrete your hormones. The cardiovascular system, this is your heart and all the blood vessels. It's a transport system for transporting gases such as oxygen and waste product carbon dioxide, as well as transporting nutrients and waste products to the appropriate places in the body. The lymphatic system is a defense system, things like your spleen, your lymph nodes, which are number one, helping to identify any foreign invaders and attack and destroy them. And it's also responsible for returning what we call extracellular fluid that has leaked out of the cells, some of the fluid from the blood that leaks out, and it returns it back to the blood circulatory system, trying to maintain a constant volume there. The respiratory system, this deals with your lungs and the gas exchange, taking in oxygen, getting rid of carbon dioxide. It's going to play a role in helping to maintain the pH balance in the blood. Your digestive system, starting at the mouth, going through the esophagus and stomach and your intestines, etc., is going to be taking in nutrients and then absorbing those nutrients and then getting rid of the waste. And then the urinary system, these are your kidneys, your bladders, you're going to be filtering. The kidneys act as a filter. Once again, getting rid of any toxic materials, but it also plays a role with the pH of your blood, determining at this particular moment, we're going to filter out the blood and then determine what we put back in the blood. What are the needs right now versus what it's either going to end up being put back in the blood or it gets put in your urine. And then the reproductive system essentially is for survival of the species. When you look at any living organism, not just human, but any living organism, there are certain characteristics that we consider the organism to have in order to classify it as living. And some of these functions are listed here: organization, metabolism, responsiveness, movement, development, growth, and reproduction. So these characteristics or these functions are necessary for human life. Organization. This is talking about how all of the building block components of the body are not just randomly thrown in. They are very organized. Cells have a very distinct internal compartment. And as we talk about these different functions and characterizations, keep in mind you can look at the entire organism, but you can also look at the cellular level. So it tends to hold true at both levels. So when you look at a cell in terms of organization, there are certain organelles, certain compartments that are inside the cell. We will talk about these later when we talk about details of the cell in another chapter. But each one of these compartments, they have a very specific function. They're to make protein. They're to break down waste products. They're to make energy, etc. But they all have to be organized in a certain way for them to function properly. And then when you look at the entire organism, in this case the entire person, you can see how the body is organized very efficiently as to the placement of where different organs are, and then it's very organized in terms of keeping the internal environment of your body. Inside your body, that environment is very different than the outside environment that you're in. And this is maintained by the skin. At the cellular level, this is maintained by the plasma membrane. That you keep this very regulated, very controlled environment. Basically, you're controlling what moves in and out of the cell. You are controlling what moves in and out of the body, depending on which level you're working at. So it's very, very organized. As I said, it's not just randomly thrown together. And this is showing at the cell how you have these various organelles. And for a eukaryotic cell where you have a nucleus here, you're going to have the nucleolus inside. You're going to have the endoplasmic reticulum right around the nucleus. You're going to have lots of mitochondria for producing energy. You're going to have Golgi vesicle, Golgi apparatus fairly close to the endoplasmic reticulum. They're all kind of organized the same way. Metabolism, this is referring to the combination of all the chemical reactions that are occurring in the body. Now, you can look at it once again in the body. You can also look at it at the cellular level where it includes all of the chemical reactions that are occurring at that cellular level. So for metabolism, it's time at taking in nutrients, which are then going to be broken down. Why are they broken down? Because when you break down nutrients, that releases energy. And that energy is required to maintain all of the physiological processes, all the various reactions that are occurring. These reactions have to occur or cell death will happen. So if the reactions don't occur, the cell's going to die. How do the reactions occur? They have to have energy in order to make them run. Where do they get the energy from? From breaking down the donut or the hamburger or french fries that you just ate. Anabolic reactions are reactions that require the input of energy. And why is this? Because you are making larger molecules by combining small molecules together. So you're going from small to large. Catabolism, these reactions are releasing energy, so they're the reverse. Now you're taking the large molecule and you're breaking them apart. Whenever you break a bond, whenever you break something, that's going to release energy. This slide is just showing you an example of the many different types of reactions that can be occurring within a cell at any one time. So you can see some of them are fairly complex, some of them are following a certain pathway, and depending on the needs of the cell, you can have all of these going on at the same time. So that's just to give you an idea of the amount of chemical activity that's occurring at the cellular level. And this is just showing what I talked about before, that when you take a large molecule and you break it into smaller components, that is catabolism, and it's going to release energy. Now, if you have small molecules, you have to input the energy to get large ones, and that's anabolism. So these are the reverse. But where do you get the energy from for an anabolic reaction that you have to put in? It comes from the catabolic reactions. So you have to have both of these occurring together. One is providing energy for the cell, the other one is using energy. Responsiveness, this is just referring to the ability for the organism, or once again the cell, if you're talking at the cellular level, to respond to a changing environment. We all know our environment is constantly changing. Well, you have to be able to respond to that. And when we're talking about a changing environment, we may be saying that the internal environment is changing or the external environment is changing. So you have to have a lot of means of being able to respond. Like this is showing it. If there's a candle burning and you stick your hand near it, it's going to be hot. And so what are you going to do? You're going to move that hand away. Movement is referring to all kinds of movement, very large movements that you can visibly see, such as running, but also movements at the cellular level. There are some cells that do move, or they have components on it. They have these extensions known as cilia that are constantly moving in, say, your trachea to help move phlegm, keeping debris out of your lungs. Development refers to the changes that the body goes throughout life. Now, obviously, the very beginning of your life, you look different now. Number one, you've grown, but you've also had other changes that have occurred through life. One process that happens is the initial cells right after fertilization are called stem cells, and they all look the same. And those stem cells, they're dividing and producing more cells. And at a certain point, it will go through a process called differentiation. And essentially what that is when a cell gets the message as to how it is supposed to specialize. Is it supposed to become a heart muscle cell? Is it supposed to become a nerve cell? Maybe it's supposed to become a bone cell. So that's what differentiation is. All cells have the same DNA, but not everything is expressed the same way. It's not making the same proteins from one type of cell to another. And so development is referring to this whole differentiation process, say in the process of where cells are going to be specialized to become your bone cells, and you start forming the skeleton. That's a little different than what happens, say, for the nervous system, and it's different than what happens for the urinary system. Throughout your life, the body's constantly going through changes. Your skeleton, your bones you're going to find are constantly changing depending on the pressures and tension that you're putting on them. We all know, I don't care who you are, everybody's had some type of an injury. You've got to have a way for the cells to repair those damaged and injured cells and grow, not only in size, but to repair things. So this is showing how you start with these stem cells, but when they receive the code or the message to differentiate, like I said, some will become, in this case, say your intestinal cells versus your red blood cells versus your muscle cells, but they all originate from stem cells. Growth is referring to just increase in size, and the fact that you start over here, as you can see, with one cell, it goes through cell division, and you end up with 2 new cells. Then each of those will grow and divide, and you end up now here with a cluster of multiple cells until you finally end up with your organism. Reproduction is the formation of a new species from those original parental organisms, and the whole purpose of reproduction is survival of the species. So once again, you're going to start with one cell, end up with 2 cells at the cellular level here. And for humans, obviously, you end up with 2 parents. We'll end up reproduction, end up with a new individual. What are some of the requirements for human life? Well, oxygen is required, nutrients, temperature, and atmospheric pressure. Oxygen is a necessary component for certain chemical reactions that produce ATP. And ATP is the form of energy that is most frequently used in the cells. So whenever you see ATP, you think energy. Well, in order to produce that energy to run all of these reactions, one of the final steps, oxygen, is a requirement. Without oxygen, there would be very little, if any, ATP production. In some cases, you would have a small amount, but not enough to sustain at the cellular level, much less the whole organism level, for long periods of time. And so what happens is you don't have the energy, means the chemical reactions will cease. So if there's no ATP, there's no chemical reactions. If there's no chemical reactions, that means the cell's going to die. With the lack of oxygen, brain damage occurs on average anywhere between 4 to 6 minutes. With no oxygen, brain damage starts occurring. And usually within 10 minutes, the entire organism, in this case human, will die. Nutrients, these are essential for survival. There's 3 broad categories of essential nutrients. Water, your nutrients such as carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, and then micronutrients such as vitamins and minerals. Micronutrients are needed in just very small, minute amounts, which is why they're called micronutrients. Water and your regular nutrients, such as I said, the carbohydrates, etc., those are often referred to as macronutrients because you need those in larger amounts, larger concentrations. And those will be discussed in more detail in the chemistry chapter. temperature, there is a narrow temperature range that supports life. And why is this? Well, because the chemical reactions that are occurring in the cell that are necessary to sustain life only occur in a narrow temperature range. Now, I say a narrow temperature range. This is looking very broadly. You might be thinking, well, you know, I know people have been at really cold temperatures and very hot temperatures. Yes, that's true, but you know, we're talking about the entire temperature scale. It's a very narrow range. High temperatures, what happens here? Well, typically high temperature increases the rate of metabolism. And you might be thinking, oh, well, that's not too bad. The problem with that is it reaches a certain point where it's too high. What it does, it interferes with the molecular structure. Remember, structure determines function. So if it disrupts that molecular structure, that means reactions can no longer occur. And we'll see how, as an example, high temperature will disrupt the protein structure. If the protein structure is disrupted, then the protein can no longer function. That protein is necessary for the chemical reactions to occur. Therefore, chemical reaction cannot occur. And once again, if they cannot occur, those reactions, then the cell will die. And typically, if you're talking about a high temperature, you're not talking about a high temperature just for one cell, but you're talking about for the entire organism, which means it's not just one cell dying, it's most of them. Low temperature decreases the rate of metabolism. It can also interfere with the viscosity. The things that are normally liquid oftentimes kind of gel and thicken up with cold temperatures, and so then they can't flow as well, and that interferes obviously also with the entire physiology of the organism. So this is just showing that yes, on Earth we do have, now this is showing different what we call biomes, but for temperature, just showing temperature extremes. You know, typically right along the equator, you've got very warm temperatures, and as you move away from that, the temperatures get much cooler. Temperatures where we are relatively warm, but are going to be very different than, say, way up here in northern Canada. Is it possible for humans to survive in a temperature range as what we see here on Earth? To a certain degree, yes. Your body makes adjustments for that, as we'll see in a moment. Personally, the coldest that I have ever been was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That was when I was living in northern Idaho, and there's a severe Arctic cold front that came down. It wasn't pleasant, I'll tell you that. And then the hottest that I have ever been in was 119 degrees Fahrenheit was the actual temperature. That was when I was visiting Death Valley in August. Not one of the smartest moves I've ever made, but it was hot. But obviously survived because I'm here. Atmospheric pressure. The pressure is a force that one substance exerts on another substance that it's in contact with. And you might think, why do I care about atmospheric pressure? It's very important in that it helps keep gases in the blood dissolved. It also is a very critical role in helping you to breathe. Because with pressure, if things are at two different pressures, things will want to flow from high pressure to low pressure. So when you inhale, the atmospheric pressure is a little bit higher than that of what is in your lungs. So the air when you inhale is actually naturally just going to want to flow in to the lungs. And then you have the reverse happen when you exhale, that the pressure then builds up in the lungs, and then it's higher than what's outside, so it's naturally going to flow out. So you need to maintain this pressure. One of the problems that you have is, say if anybody hikes or goes up to a higher altitude, the pressure there is less. And so it can lead to shortness of breath. It interferes with that normal breathing rate. And depending on how high up you go, you can actually end up with altitude sickness. Why do you get altitude sickness? Well, there's less atmospheric pressure. So, as it says, it reduces that gas exchange that's occurring in the lungs. That leads to shortness of breath. In addition, you may notice that the individual may suffer from headaches, nausea, confusion, may not have all of these symptoms, but it can be a very, very serious, in extreme cases, can actually be deadly. So that is a problem that some people experience if they do, like I say, a lot of mountain hiking, and certainly extreme mountain hiking, such as places like Mount McKinley. And when I lived in New Mexico, for a while I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is at an altitude of 7,000 feet above sea level. Even Albuquerque, where I spent over 20 years, is over 5,300 feet above sea level, so it's a mile high. And if people are not used to it, if you drive there, you may not notice as much the altitude sickness because you've gradually increased and gotten used to the altitude. But we many times had people come visit us where they flew in and they were not used to that altitude. And you kind of had to give them a couple days to get acclimated to it. If you did too much too soon, they literally got sick from the altitude. And what was the reason? It's because of the different atmospheric pressure that they're not used to. So homeostasis, once again, that deals with the internal conditions being maintained within a certain range. Now, normally there's a certain set point, but then there's a range, a little bit above, a little bit below that set point, that's most efficient for all the proper functions in the body. And so things are constantly being monitored so that if, for whatever reason, you go outside of this range, the body can make adjustments. So as an example, like temperature, your body temperature, internal body temperature starts to change. That's being constantly monitored in the body. And it's like, okay, we have a change here. We need to adjust it back within that normal range. What happens if you don't adjust it and it stays outside the normal range? That's when you start to have various disorders occurring. That's going to put you at a higher risk for diseases to occur. If it goes too far outside that normal range, it can actually be fatal. So it's constantly being monitored. And internal conditions, I'm talking about the pH in your blood, the temperature, the amount of calcium. Most things are going to be monitored in the blood. The amount of calcium, the amount of sodium, the amount of potassium, all of these things are being monitored. And how can the body respond? Well, there's two different types of feedback systems in the way that it will respond. There's a negative feedback and there's a positive feedback. So with homeostasis, the feedback systems, both of them, there's three parts to it. There's a sensor or a receptor. This is the component that's receiving a stimulus. It's monitoring that particular process. And it's very specific. So if it's monitoring for, say, calcium concentration in the blood, it doesn't care about sodium or calcium chloride. It's only monitoring the one thing. If it's monitoring for high temperature, that's it. So it's very specific. It's going to receive that stimulus, and then it will send that information to the next component, which is the control center. Typically, this is going to be located somewhere in the brain that's going to receive this information and, okay, this is what the current value is. Let's see how this compares to our set point. It's not set point, okay, well, does it fall within the normal range? We're okay, we don't have to do anything. Or if it is outside the normal range, then it determines what type of response needs to be made. And then the effector is the component that's going to cause the change. So it's going to receive the information of, okay, sweat gland, you need to start secreting sweat, or whatever the case may be. So your whole process of homeostasis with the sensor control and effector, in some ways you can kind of think it being similar to, say, a thermostat in your home, that you know how you set it for a certain temperature, and in the summer if it gets too high, then your AC is going to kick on. If it's wintertime and the temperature gets too low, then the heater's going to kick on to bring it back up. So it's kind of like your body's doing the same thing. And this is just showing that you get that stimulus, it's going to activate the sensor. Once the sensor receives this information, it is going to send that information on to a control center. Usually this control center is going to be located in the brain or spinal cord, typically the brain. And then from there, that will then stimulate or activate the effector, so you get a response to whatever that initial stimulus was. Negative feedback, it's the most common type of feedback. So most of your responses are going to be fall into the situation. And this is where the response of that effector is to reverse the situation and return everything back to within that normal range. So once again, if you use internal body temperature as an example, when internal body temperature is increasing, that stimulus is received by your receptor. It sends it to the control center. Your control center goes, okay, we're getting outside that normal range. That internal body temperature is rising. We have to do something about it. So what is it going to do? Well, it will stimulate sweat glands to start sweating, because when you sweat, water carries heat with it. And so as you sweat, it's going to release some of the heat, take some of it away. It's also going to stimulate an increase of blood flow to the superficial layers of the skin, so up along the surface. And why is that? That's because blood carries heat with it as well. And if you have more of the blood going to the surface of the skin, you still maintain blood flow everywhere in the body, but you just kind of adjust some of the concentration. So more of it's going towards the skin, so that the heat can dissipate. All of this is going to help cool the body down. So once again, in this case, what happens is the body temperature is increasing. You get that message, sends it to the brain, which interprets, yes, it's getting high enough, we need to do something about this. And the sweat glands, in this case, will be activated, cooling that temperature back down. So you're responding back to that initial stimulus. And this is, I included this just to show you with the blood vessels, because a lot of people don't really think about this much. As your body temperature is increasing, as I said, you'll increase your blood flow. You often have multiple pathways, and you can open up more of these to get more blood to the surface so that the heat is dissipated. The reverse, when you're really cold, you're going to decrease the amount of blood flow to the surface to try to keep the heat in and not lose as much. So you can see in this area, you're still getting a blood supply. And when you're talking about the skin, the surface of the skin right here, these are actually dead cells anyway, so they don't need the blood. So it's okay that you decrease the amount of blood right through here. And that way you're keeping the blood deeper in the body and you don't lose as much heat. Positive feedback, this is where now, same type thing, you have a stimulus to the sensory or receptors, which then stimulate the control area, which then is going to monitor, and then, depending on what's happening, will stimulate effectors for the response. The difference is that the response is going to either increase or magnify whatever that change is instead of reversing it. So you're moving out the normal range. You're going to have a response so you get even further and further and further away from that normal range. Two classic examples of this in the humans is with blood clotting when you have an injury, and also labor contractions. So when you have an injury, what happens at that site, say you have a blood vessel and there's an injury there, it's bleeding, there are certain chemicals that are released that will attract platelets to the area. And the platelets start to stick together, and they stick together at that injured site. Well, that's going to release even more chemicals to increase even more platelets to come attract them and get them to stick to the site. Instead of reversing it, you've got even more coming. And the more you have, well, that's going to attract even more platelets who are going to come and stick together there until you plug up that injury site and prevent blood loss. So it keeps attracting more, and you keep sticking platelets together to plug the hole. In a similar fashion, with labor contractions, what happens is the baby pushes with its head against the cervix. That is going to send certain nerve impulses to the brain, which stimulates the release of a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is secreted, it's in the bloodstream, and now what does it do? Well, the effect that it has down on the uterus is that it stimulates contractions. What do the contractions do? Well, it's going to push the baby even closer to the cervix. And that's going to stimulate even more impulses to stimulate more secretion of oxytocin. And so this just keeps increasing until the birth of the baby. So most feedback mechanisms are negative, but there are a few that are positive. All of it is to maintain, for homeostasis, is maintain that proper internal balance of that internal environment, kind of trying to keep everything in equilibrium within a certain range. It's a nice balance. You don't want things getting all out of whack, because that's when problems happen. As long as everything is maintained within their normal ranges, once again, your pH, your calcium, your sodium, everything's maintained within certain levels. That is what normal functioning is, and that should decrease chances for disorders and diseases. In A&P, you are going to be studying what the normal anatomy is, what the normal physiological functionings are, so that you have to know what the normal is, that foundation, before you can understand what's going on with diseases and disorders. In terms of studying the last part of this chapter, where it goes into the anatomical terminology, the anatomical position, the various planes that we have, the various cavities that we have, membranes, etc., that is not going to be covered in the lecture portion. Instead, that will be covered extensively in the lab portion for this course.